I didn't die doing something worth remembering. No last stand, no dramatic speech, no moment anyone would bother putting in a story. Just a Tuesday night, a government research facility somewhere outside the city, and a syringe full of something they called experimental compound 7. I was a level 0 awakened. And if you don't know what that means, let me save you some time. It means nothing good is coming. You wake up one morning with a tiny spark of power inside you, barely enough to heat a cup of coffee, and the world does not throw you a party. Instead, you get a file number, a government logo on a badge, and a white van parked outside your building at 6 in the morning, like it was always going to be there. They came in suits, smiles that stopped exactly at the waterline of their eyes, like someone had drawn them on with a very precise marker and called it done. They used words like voluntary participation and national security interest, and you will be fully compensated for the time you contribute to this program. My name is Kai. I was 23 years old, completely broken, apparently not smart enough to run when every single instinct I had was screaming at me to do exactly that. So I signed the form, watched my own hand move across the paper like it belonged to someone else entirely. Felt nothing good about it, even as I did it. 3 weeks inside that facility was all it took to understand the truth of what the program actually was. Nobody in there was getting stronger or better or more powerful. We were getting used up, like batteries inserted into something too large for them, drained completely and then quietly discarded somewhere out of sight. I watched a level 2 guy walk into a procedure room on a Monday morning with a coffee in his hand and a half smile on his face like it was just another appointment. By Thursday, his bed was made with clean sheets, and nobody said his name in any hallway I walked through for the rest of the week. The night they came for me, I was emotionally ready, which is a completely different thing from actually being ready, and I want to be honest about that distinction. They walked me down a white hallway that smelled like antiseptic and something I can only describe as broken promises sealed in a ventilation system. I counted the ceiling tiles as I walked. 41. I remember thinking that was a strange and useless thing for a brain to decide to hold on to in its final minutes. The needle went in. I had exactly one thought. Seriously, 23 years of alarm clocks and overdue rent, and this is genuinely how it ends for me. And then nothing at all. Pure black. Total silence. The specific kind of quiet that only exists when the whole world has been switched off completely at whatever powers the source. Then cold arrived all at once, sharp and serious. Then the sound of wind moving through trees. Then the smell of pine and something ancient living underneath the soil. I opened my eyes and saw forest, dark and massive and the kind of old that cities spend centuries trying to become and never quite manage to pull off. And then I looked down at what my hands were supposed to be and found something else waiting for me there instead. 4 paws. Black as actual ink, almost completely invisible against the dark forest floor beneath me, like the ground had grown extensions. I need you to understand something before we go any further. I did not handle this particular moment with even a small amount of grace. What came out of my throat was a sound I had never made in my entire first life. Somewhere between a howl and a genuine question about the nature of reality, it echoed off every tree within range and launched approximately a dozen birds into the night sky like I had detonated a noise complaint inside a very quiet library. Great start, Kai. A truly iconic first impression to make in whatever this new existence turned out to be. Really set the tone perfectly. I told my legs to stand up and carry me somewhere with more dignity. All 4 of them reviewed that request and collectively decided it could wait until later. So I face-planted directly into the forest floor with my new wolf face. The ground tasted like pine needles and the specific flavor of humiliation that has no good name. I lay there for a full minute and just ran the numbers on my situation. Dead, confirmed. Reborn, also confirmed. Current species, wolf, apparently. Personal feelings about that, still loading. But the body is brand new hardware running software from a completely different era, and it responds to your commands with the enthusiasm of a government office on a Friday afternoon. I stopped fighting it. And that was when my wolf instincts came online all at once. Like a door I didn't know existed just got kicked clean off its hinges from the other side. I could smell everything simultaneously. The rot under a fallen log 6 meters to my left. Cold mineral water from a stream running somewhere east of where I was lying. And the sharp electric scent of something very large moving through the trees directly north of me. Deliberate movement, getting closer with every second that passed. She appeared between the pines the way nightmares appear, without announcement, without warning, without any visible concern for how I was doing emotionally in that moment. Massive silver wolf, easily twice my size, with eyes the pale color of winter sky right before the temperature drops, below anything reasonable. She looked at me the exact way a teacher looks at the one student who clearly did not open a single page of the material before showing up to the exam. She sniffed me once, long and deliberate, reading whatever information I was broadcasting into the cold air around me. Then she picked me up by the scruff of my neck, like I was a dirty sock she had located on the bathroom floor. She carried me through the dark forest without a single word of explanation and without slowing down for anything. Which, to be completely fair, we were wolves. Verbal explanations were not currently available in a format either of us could access. I decided to call her Silver. She deposited me inside a den that smelled like earth and animals, and something I would later understand was called belonging, even if I couldn't name it yet. 3 pups were already sleeping inside in one tangled pile of fur and tails and small legs arranged in directions that made no geometric sense whatsoever. One of them cracked open a single eye, assessed me with absolute zero interest, and immediately returned to sleep like I was the least remarkable thing that had happened all week. Warm welcome to the second life. I really felt the warmth of that one eye opening and closing again on my behalf. Truly moving. I curled up at the outer edge of the pile and attempted to think clearly about everything that had just happened to me in the last however many minutes. New world, wolf body, forest location completely unknown, personal power level also unknown, current enemy count, one entire government organization, location also unknown. But I was alive again. That single fact outweighed every item on the bad side of the list by a margin I couldn't even calculate properly yet. And I remembered things. 3 weeks inside that facility, I had listened to every hallway conversation, every break room complaint, every sentence that got cut short when someone noticed I was in the room. A researcher named Dr. Oren had said the words Project Hollow and Shadow Class Specimen in the same breath one afternoon, before realizing I was 3 feet away and going completely quiet. I'd filed that away immediately and had not stopped thinking about it since. I didn't know the full meaning yet, but I was a black wolf in a dark forest, freshly back from the dead. And the word shadow was beginning to feel like it was going to become very relevant to whatever happened next in this second life I had somehow been handed. Morning came fast. Silver returned and dropped a chunk of raw meat on the den floor, stepped back against the wall, and watched with those pale eyes to see what would happen. The other 3 pups launched at it instantly, snarling and shoving and producing maximum noise for what turned out to be minimum actual strategy from any of them. I sat back and watched the entire disaster unfold from a comfortable distance. I thought, this is not how the second life ends. Not in a puppy food fight inside a dirt hole in the ground. I waited for the chaos to run out of momentum on its own. Then I walked up calmly to what remained and ate it. No sound, no drama, no performance for anyone watching. Silver watched me the entire time with her head tilted slightly to one side, reading something in my behavior that didn't match whatever category she had filed wolf pups under. A pup that doesn't panic over food. She had clearly never encountered that particular variable before. Good. I needed her curious about me, more than I needed anything else right now. Over the following days, I mapped everything I could reach. Pack structure, territory boundaries, the rotating behavior of prey near the creek, and the eastern wind that kept bringing me that same wrong smell. 3 littermates worth cataloging. One massive and loud with zero self-awareness, who I named Tank in my head. One fast and nervous who I called Flicker. And one quiet female who watched everything carefully before committing to any action. She reminded me of the only people from my previous life I had genuinely respected. I named her Scout. The forest itself was enormous and genuinely old in a way that had nothing to do with maps or property lines. Something about the light through the trees felt like it predated the concept of cities entirely. And underneath the smell of pine and mud and prey animals, growing a little stronger every single day, was something that had no business existing in a forest this old. Antiseptic, metal. A specific chemical combination I recognized from 3 weeks of breathing it through a ventilation system in a facility I was supposed to have died inside. The lab smell was out there in the trees to the east, distant but real, and getting less distant with every morning that passed without me doing anything useful about it. They hadn't just killed me and filed the paperwork and moved on to the next experiment on the list. They had followed me here, into whatever this world actually was. On the 7th day, the Alpha came home, and the entire forest changed its behavior the moment he stepped back into the territory. Birds went quiet, mid-sound. Small animals froze completely where they stood. He walked out of the tree line into the clearing, like gravity had slightly different terms for him than it applied to everything else living in the same space. Black fur. A scar running from his left ear all the way to his jaw, like someone had made a decision with something sharp a long time ago. Eyes the color of iron left out in the rain. He assessed each pup methodically, moving down the line. Tank rolled over immediately with the speed of someone who had rehearsed it. Flicker practically dissolved. Scout lowered her head with quiet dignity. Then he reached me. He sniffed once, then a second time, slower and more deliberate. He raised his head and fixed those iron-colored eyes directly on my face and held them there. I did not roll over. I held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to prove I had a spine, short enough not to read as a challenge, and then looked slightly to the side. a skill I had spent years developing across a series of performance reviews with managers who had confused being loud with being correct about anything. He stared at me for a long, heavy moment. In this world, I was learning fast that passing and failing look completely identical until the consequences eventually show up. Then he turned and walked away without making a single sound. Greatest exit I had witnessed in 2 complete lifetimes. I had no notes, no critiques, nothing to add to that performance. Silver let out one long, slow breath the moment he disappeared back into the trees. The other 3 pups were still visibly shaking a full 2 minutes after he was gone. I looked at the forest, where the alpha had gone, and thought about the lab smell drifting in from the east and growing stronger every morning I woke up and didn't address it. Didn't. That night, under more stars than I had ever seen in my first life, I made myself a promise that I intended to keep regardless of what this world threw at me next. I was not walking down another white hallway. I was not becoming anyone's level 0 specimen again. Not in this life. Not in whatever life came after this one either. And whatever Project Hollow actually was, whatever Shadow Class meant to the people who had followed me here, they were going to find out very soon that I was not lost. What I didn't know yet was that 2 kilometers east, beneath the forest floor, a screen was displaying my biometric readings to a man who recognized exactly what they meant, and Dr. Oren, the researcher who had personally put the needle in my arm on a Tuesday night, was already smiling at what he saw on that screen. If you were Kai and you woke up in that forest knowing the lab was 2 kilometers away, would you run deeper into the trees or go straight toward them? Drop it in the comments below. The smell got stronger on day 8. Not by a little, but by enough that I woke before Silver did, which had never happened once in the entire first week. I lay at the den edge with my nose pointed east and let the wind tell me what it was carrying. Antiseptic, metal, rubber seals on pressurized containers humming somewhere below ground. And underneath all of it, something new. Ozone. The specific electrical smell that collects inside rooms where high output equipment runs continuously without any break between cycles. They had established infrastructure. This wasn't a search party following a trail. Someone had built a permanent operation here, which meant this location had been chosen before I ever arrived in it. That thought sat in my chest like cold metal for the rest of the morning, and no amount of wolf instinct telling me to go find breakfast made it feel any less heavy than it already was. I walked to the den entrance and looked east through the trees. Nothing visible from the surface, just forest layered over more forest, going back further than my eyes could meaningfully resolve. But buried infrastructure meant people, and people operating that far below ground, that far from any road, meant someone had selected this location with a great deal of deliberate care and planning. Silver emerged 20 minutes later, read the eastern air with her nose, and looked at me in the specific way I was slowly learning to translate from wolf into something my brain could actually use. She had sensed what was wrong to the east. Her eyes were asking whether I had sensed it too, and what exactly I intended to do about it, before it became her problem to manage on my behalf. I looked back at her and thought, working on it. Minimum 48 hours needed. Please hold all further questions until the timeline has been updated with something concrete. She went back inside to check on the pups, which in wolf language meant, acceptable response for now, figure it out, and make sure the result does not require me to fix anything after the fact. Fair enough. I had received worse feedback in my previous life and survived all of it, usually by building a spreadsheet, a tool not currently available in this format. I felt that loss personally. I spent the morning running the eastern boundary alone. The alpha's scent marked a line through the forest on specific trees, evenly spaced, creating a wall that only wolf noses could fully read. On the far side of that line, the synthetic smell thickened immediately until it was almost the dominant note in everything coming from that direction on any available wind. I stopped at the boundary and did not cross it. Entering unprepared was the kind of decision that had already killed me once. I was not going to let it develop a track record in this life. In my previous life, I had learned the specific cost of walking into a room full of people who want something from you without first understanding what they want and why they want it. I was not signing any more forms. Not in this life. Not under any circumstances I could currently construct. Not even with an excellent pen and a very reasonable-sounding explanation attached to it. So I sat at the boundary and listened. Wolf hearing at full attention picks up things human equipment would need calibration to match. Footsteps on compressed soil at 200 meters. The mechanical hum of ventilation running underground. Low voices carrying the flat professional tone of people who are at work rather than taking a walk. At least 3 individuals, possibly more. Ventilation underground meant the facility was operating below the surface, which explained why every observation run I had done from every ridge had shown nothing but ordinary forest. They had buried the entire operation, built infrastructure under the forest floor, and covered the surface well enough that nothing about it gave itself away to anything looking from above. I turned and ran back toward the den with the pace of someone who has reclassified a problem from concerning to urgent and needs to start making actual decisions rather than gathering more data. Tank was awake when I returned, engaged in his reliable morning routine of attempting to establish dominance over a pine cone that had rolled into the den entrance sometime during the night. Scout was near the back of the den, watching Tank's situation unfold with the patience of something that has fully accepted that some problems are going to resolve on their own schedule, regardless. I sat near Scout and ran the numbers. Underground facility to the east. Multiple personnel. High output equipment running continuously. A long-term planned operation. Someone who knew exactly where here was. In the facility where I had died. The researchers had discussed threshold events during hallway conversations I was not close enough to overhear by accident. I had been close enough on purpose. Moments when a level zero's power either crystallized into something functional or faded completely, and the subject became, as one researcher put it on a Thursday afternoon, medically uninteresting. Dr. Oren had an entire whiteboard dedicated to threshold events in a room I had seen through a window while walking a hallway at the exact angle that made the interior visible for about 4 seconds. The theory, assembled from documents left face up and sentences that got cut short when someone noticed me standing nearby, was that the right environment could force a threshold event artificially, which meant the underground facility wasn't just tracking a missing subject. It had potentially been designed to trigger something in me specifically, to use this body in this world as a controlled condition. That was considerably worse than the previous conclusion. The previous conclusion had already been sitting comfortably in the category of things I did not enjoy examining at any significant length. I looked at my paws. Black. Completely black. No glow, no visible evidence that the level 0 spark I had carried into death had done anything noticeably different on the other side of whatever I had crossed, but the word shadow kept circling back. Dr. Oren's voice saying shadow class specimen before going quiet. My black fur in a pack where every other wolf ran some shade of gray or brown, and the fact that on my first night, lying still in the dark forest after the faceplant, the darkness around me had felt less like an absence of light and more like something that was paying attention. I had dismissed that detail then because basic logistics were consuming everything I had. But memory files things whether you ask it to or not, and that specific file had not closed itself. On day 9, the Alpha returned in early afternoon, which was unusual enough that every wolf in the den registered the change in schedule without anyone needing to communicate it to anyone else. He stood at the entrance and assessed each of us. When he reached me, he held the look slightly longer than the others. Then he looked east, then back at me, with those iron-colored eyes steady. He had been reading this territory for years before I arrived. He had smelled the facility before I had. He had come back early to confirm whether the strange black pup knew about it too. I met his eyes, looked east deliberately, then back at him. The closest approximation of a nod that a wolf body without the mechanical architecture for nodding could manage in the moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, but the specific adjustment an experienced person makes. When a situation requires attention they had not previously decided to allocate to it. He turned and walked back out without a sound. Standard communication method. Everything stated, nothing wasted on volume or repetition. Exit executed with no theatrical elements of any kind. Silver appeared after he left, looked at the entrance, then at me, with an expression that translated clearly as, "Whatever is happening now, you are formally part of it. Adjust your plans accordingly." That night I waited until the pack was sleeping and went outside alone. Not east, toward the boundary. North, toward a clearing I had been quietly noting on every solo run for the past 10 days. A space 400 meters from the den where the canopy opened up completely. And where nothing blocked whatever I was about to attempt doing alone in the dark without anyone watching. I sat in the center and focused inward. Not pushing, not straining, not performing for a researcher holding a clipboard. The exact opposite of everything the facility had trained level zeros to do. The researchers had called the correct approach internal resonance, locating the spark inside yourself and holding attention on it without demanding it perform, without pressure from any direction. In the facility, we had been pushed constantly, strained toward it, reach hard, demonstrated on command for the people with evaluation sheets. Every instinct I carried from that experience said to push. I did the complete opposite. I sat in the cold clearing and let attention rest on whatever was inside without asking it to do anything at all. No demands, no deadline, no clipboard, no one watching. For a long time, nothing happened. The forest made its nighttime sounds. Wind moved through the upper branches in that sound that has no human equivalent I could name with any accuracy. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not with any visible light or display. Just a subtle change in how the darkness around me was sitting in relation to where I was positioned in the clearing. The shadows at the edge were closer than they should have been given the available light. Not threatening, not advancing. Present in a way that felt aware rather than simply passive and physical. Like they had been waiting for me to stop pushing and just show up to the space I was already supposed to be standing in. I held the stillness, and the shadows held their closer position. Then a twig snapped about 60 meters south, and every wolf instinct fired at once, and I was on my feet facing the sound before my human brain had finished registering that I had moved at all. Nothing came through the trees. The forest held still for 30 seconds. Then the small nighttime sounds resumed, and whatever had made the sound either wasn't a threat or had decided to leave. I stood in the clearing for another minute with my heart working hard, then walked back to the den and lay at the outer edge of the pile, looking at the darkness inside and thinking about what had happened. The shadows had responded. That was real, not imagined, not forced. It had happened because I had stopped demanding that it not happen and simply let the attention rest in the right place. Shadow class specimen. Dr. Oren going completely quiet when he realized I had heard those two words. He hadn't been worried about a general security issue. He'd been worried I might understand. I was beginning to understand. And that understanding was simultaneously the most interesting thing that had happened in 2 lifetimes and the most immediately dangerous thing I could currently know. I stopped beside her and let my own nose work. A few more seconds to find the thread underneath the forest noise. When I found it, I understood immediately why she had stopped the way she had. Another wolf, not from our pack. Male, young, and carrying underneath his scent the layered chemical smell of stress that accumulates in a body running hard without adequate rest or food. Scout looked at me. I looked at the direction the scent was coming from. We stood doing the wolf equivalent of a fast, silent conversation about what the correct next move actually was here. I moved toward the scent slowly, body posture dropped low enough to read as non-threatening to something already stressed and potentially close to making a bad decision out of sheer exhaustion. Scout followed a body length behind me. Her version of, I disagree with this call, but I'm curious enough about the outcome to stay close rather than walk away from what happens next. He was behind a fallen log about 200 meters into the northern tree line. Young, gray, with a white chest patch that made him look like a shirt that didn't quite fit the rest of him. His back left leg was in a steel jaw trap. Spring-loaded jaws, chains staked into the frozen ground, the kind of equipment a facility perimeter team would deploy to monitor territorial movement. He had been there long enough for the snow around the trap to carry the specific disturbance pattern that comes from a body that fought hard against something and eventually stopped fighting. He heard me coming, and his head came up immediately, eyes sharp and alert despite everything his body was dealing with. Still dangerous, still fully present. Both of those were very good signs. One warning sound from the back of his throat, low and controlled. The kind of sound that says, I am aware of you, and I have not yet reached a conclusion about what I'm going to do about it. I stopped, sat down in the snow about 3 meters from him, and looked at him without approaching further. Let him read me the way Silver had read me on my very first night in this world. We stayed like that for several minutes, breathing shallow but steady. The trap had caught him above the ankle joint, bad but not the worst location for something that still had a chance. He put his head back down on the snow. Not surrender. The movement of something that has decided to extend a small amount of trust to one thing in a situation that has already costed everything else. I moved to the trap and studied it. Steel jaw with a spring on each side that needed simultaneous compression to release. Straightforward, in theory. Significantly more complicated with wolf paws. I worked on it for a long time, trying different angles on the spring mechanism, adjusting when each attempt produced the wrong result, starting over from a new position without stopping the effort. I bent one claw backward at an angle that had no business being anatomically possible and registered nothing about it because the focus required was consuming every available resource I had. When the spring finally gave and the jaws separated and he pulled his leg free, he immediately tried to stand. The leg buckled and he went down hard into the snow and lay there breathing. I sat next to him in the snow. He looked at me for a long moment with eyes that had stayed sharp through everything. Then he pressed his muzzle briefly against the side of my neck. 1 second. Then he pulled back. In wolf language, I see what you did, I understand what it cost, and I will not forget this. That was the best translation I could produce, and I believed it was accurate enough. His leg needed time before it could carry him. He could not survive the Northern Territory alone through winter in his condition, and the trap that caught him was telling me something important. The facility was running perimeter operations on the northern boundary, too. They were mapping the full territory, not just the eastern edge. The scope was significantly larger than I had estimated. I looked at the trap logo stamped into the inner face of the jaw. Small and precise. The kind of mark you put on field equipment when you're tracking inventory across multiple active deployment sites. Multiple sites in this forest. I filed that away in the running list of everything I was learning about the operation that had followed me into this world and was now systematically surrounding the territory. I pointed my nose toward the den and started walking south. I looked back once. He watched me from the snow for a moment, then slowly got up on 3 legs and followed without any prompting from me. His name was Patch. I decided that somewhere between the trap mechanism and the moment I understood that naming wolves had become a confirmed behavioral pattern rather than an isolated incident. Getting Patch accepted by the pack, Had several potential failure points I was tracking before we arrived anywhere near the den. Outside males and established pack hierarchy made this a careful situation. But Patch had been caught in a facility trap, which meant the facility knew he existed and where he moved, which meant leaving him in the Northern Territory was leaving him available for retrieval. I was not going to do that. I'd watched enough people get left behind inside the facility to have strong and permanent feelings about the practice, regardless of what species was involved in it. Patch understood the approach protocol better than I could have coached him. He dropped his posture 200 meters from the den into textbook non-challenge positioning and held it without instruction. The alpha was outside when we arrived and was on his feet before I cleared the tree line, reading the second scent behind me with an expression that said he had already processed the situation. Patch stopped at the clearing edge. The alpha walked out and circled him once in a slow, deliberate assessment pass. Patch held completely still through the entire process without making a sound. Tank pushed out from behind the alpha with his chest forward and ears up, doing his reliable impression of someone whose input was necessary and relevant to the outcome of what was happening here. He barked once in Patch's direction and stepped forward aggressively into the clearing snow. Patch's eyes moved to Tank for 1 second with the efficiency of someone identifying where the actual authority is. Then Patch's eyes went back to the alpha. Tank continued existing in the background as a performance with an audience of one, which was the alpha, who appeared thoroughly unimpressed by the content. The alpha stepped forward past Tank, completed his assessment of Patch, then turned and walked back inside. No attack. No signal to drive Patch away. The silence doing exactly the work it needed to. Tank stood in the snow looking at a decision that had been made without consulting him or incorporating his very loud feelings about the matter in any detectable way. I walked past him back inside. Patch spent the first week near the den entrance, ate last, slept at the outer edge, moved with the careful awareness of something that understood its probationary position exactly and respected it. But he watched everything. Every interaction, every hierarchy moment, every small piece of how this group operated. He was mapping it the way I had mapped it in my first week, and that was not lost on me. On day 14, I went back to the northern boundary and pulled the trap from the ground. The stake was driven deep into frozen soil and the effort was significant, but eventually it came free. I carried it south to the fast-moving section of the creek where the water ran over rocks and never fully froze, and I dropped it in from the bank and watched it disappear under the current. No signal back to the facility, no data recovered. One fewer data point in whatever movement map they were actively building of the territory I was living inside and beginning to think of as mine. The alpha was at the den entrance when I returned from the south, having left heading north. He looked at the trap marks on my paw pads. Then he looked at my face for a long, steady moment. He made the low rumbling sound, the one I had heard twice before, the one that sat in the range of registered, adequate, no further clarification required from you on this particular matter. That sound was getting easier to understand each time I heard it. In my previous life, I had reported to people who couldn't communicate a tenth of that with a full paragraph and a follow-up conversation. Day 16, running a long loop through the Western Territory with Patch. When I caught a scent that stopped me so completely, he ran 2 body lengths past me, before noticing I wasn't still moving. Human, fresh, less than an hour old on the western tree line, but not carrying the chemical signature I had learned to associate with the facility's field personnel over the previous week of tracking them. This was different. Single individual, moving carefully in a direction that read as observation rather than transit, watching the territory from the inside edge, not crossing it to reach somewhere else. Patch caught it moments after I did. His posture dropped immediately, low, cautious, angled behind a tree stand in the specific way that removes a silhouette from a sight line without drawing attention. I moved to the ridge above the western tree line, staying low against the rock face and using the wind to ensure I was downwind of whoever was operating below. 4 minutes of careful positioning. She was about 30 meters into the tree line, standing completely still against a trunk with binoculars raised and a notebook she was writing in without looking down at the page at any point. Young, mid-20s. Wearing civilian gear, not the standardized field equipment that every facility personnel sighting I had cataloged was wearing. No visible weapons, no radio that I could see, a notebook that was clearly her own property, not any kind of institutional documentation tool. She was here independently, which was a category I did not yet have a pre-existing framework for. She stayed for 40 minutes, writing, watching, and at one point crouching to examine a set of tracks near the tree line with the focused expression of someone who understands what they are reading. Then she closed the notebook carefully, put it inside her jacket, and walked west through the tree line, moving quietly and with the awareness of someone who understood how sound traveled in old forest. Patch appeared beside me on the ridge after she was gone and looked at the spot where she had been, then at me, asking a question I did not have a complete enough answer to share with him yet. Filed under, unknown variable, potentially relevant. Watch and do not approach until I understand what she is doing in this section of forest and whether she's been here before today. That night I returned to the northern clearing and sat in the center and let the attention rest on the shadow presence the same way I had on night 9. It came faster than the first time. The darkness shifted within a few minutes of sitting still, that quality of awareness settling around me before I had fully committed to the exercise of looking inward for it, learning its location. I tried something new. Instead of holding general stillness, I focused on one specific shadow at the eastern edge of the clearing and paid attention to just that one shape of darkness in particular. It moved, not dramatically, not in any way visible from outside the clearing. It shifted about half a meter toward me in a movement that had nothing to do with wind or the angle of available light. I held the focus, and it moved another half meter. Slow, smooth, entirely unlike how physical objects respond to forces, more like the way attention moves when it finally locates what it was looking for. I sat with that for a long time. The shadow held its new position, present, attentive, not advancing further unless I asked, which I wasn't ready for yet because I didn't fully understand the mechanism. But it had moved. Because shadow class, and whatever taxonomy Dr. Oren used to categorize awakened types, apparently included the ability to interact with darkness as something other than absence of light. I walked back to the den in the dark, thinking about the facility 2 kilometers east, about the equipment running underground, about Dr. Oren looking at biometric readings on a screen and smiling at them. He had known what shadow class could become before he put the needle in my arm. He had probably designed the entire Tuesday night procedure to trigger a threshold event pointing in exactly this direction, which meant he was not waiting for me to find him. He was waiting for my ability to reach a level he could measure and use in whatever second phase the underground facility had been built to facilitate. Day 18. Silver led a coordinated hunt in the early morning while I ran the full eastern boundary alone, cataloging every trap I could locate and memorizing the exact spacing pattern between them. 11 traps total along the eastern and northern perimeters, spaced at intervals that looked random until I mapped the full set in my head and realized the apparent randomness was deliberate design. They were placed to intercept movement in a specific pattern, not random patrol movement, not natural prey-following behavior. The interception pattern matched something scouting a boundary with intent. They had been set for me specifically, not for wolves in general, for a wolf that moved like something gathering information about a boundary rather than simply living inside the territory on either side. I sat at the eastern boundary and let the full picture assemble itself. Underground facility, 11 perimeter traps, multiple personnel, a researcher who had followed a dead subject into a different world. Then I turned around and ran back to the den, because there was a boundary to protect and a perimeter to disrupt, and a second life to conduct that was not going to survive being passive about any of it. Patch met me at the western tree line on the way back. His leg was at 70%. I'd been tracking his gait for days. He fell into pace beside me without any discussion about whether he was joining. We ran back together through the late morning light and the canopy. I thought about the trap spacing pattern, the woman with the notebook, and shadows that moved when I paid the right kind of attention. The facility was closing in on its understanding of where we were. The perimeter was tightening, and the spark in this black wolf body was waking up in a direction Dr. Oren had apparently mapped in advance. The forest went quiet in the late afternoon, the way it sometimes did before weather came in from the north, every creature making small adjustments in response to information I was still learning to read. Silver came to stand beside me at the den entrance, facing north with her ears forward and her nose working at something on the edge of what I could resolve from where I was standing beside her. Then she looked at me, not with the tilted head curiosity of the first days, but something that had developed slowly over 18 days and become something I didn't yet have a wolf word for. I looked back at her and then north at whatever she had been reading in the air. The wind shifted, and on the new bearing, under pine and cold soil and distant prey, I found it, the facility smell, on the northern wind. For the first time, coming from the north rather than from the east, where the underground installation had been sitting since before I arrived in this territory. They had expanded the perimeter operation, they had moved people north, and they were no longer monitoring from a fixed position while waiting for data. They were actively moving through the territory, moving in the direction of the den where this pack was sleeping and where I had spent 18 days building something I had not planned for and could not afford to lose to anyone with a clipboard. I looked at Silver. She looked at me. Behind us in the den, Patch raised his head from the outer edge of the sleeping pile and pointed his nose north, and his eyes found mine without any hesitation. Whatever was coming would reach this location before morning. And for the first time since I had opened my eyes in a strange forest with 4 paws and no plan, I was not the only one who understood that. I didn't sleep that night. I lay at the den edge with my nose pointed north and tracked the facility smell as it moved through the dark forest like something with a schedule to keep. It wasn't approaching in a straight line, it was spreading. 2 scent threads moving in a wide arc from the north, the pattern of a flanking approach designed to surround something without alerting it. I had read about that movement pattern in a wildlife document in my previous life. Not for tracking wolves, for tracking people who didn't want to be found until you were already around them. They were moving slowly and deliberately in the dark, fully expecting to arrive at an occupied location before dawn. They had built their entire approach around one assumption. That assumption was that packs don't move dens at night. True for real wolves, but not for something inside that den with a human brain and a very personal history with research facilities. I got up without sound. Silver's head lifted immediately across the dark interior. She had not been sleeping either. Her eyes found mine without any searching at all. I looked north. Then at the sleeping pile, Tank, Flicker, Scout, and Patch at the outer edge with his leg extended. Then back at Silver. I held the look long enough to make the meaning clear. She was on her feet before I finished the thought. She moved to the pups and woke them with one specific sound. Short, low, not alarming, but completely non-negotiable in its instruction. Tank came up immediately, looking at the entrance with the expression of someone told to prepare for something without being told what it is and choosing readiness over questions. Good instinct. Flicker rose, nervous but contained, ears working in every direction at once, reading air for whatever had pulled her out of sleep. Scout came up with zero wasted motion between asleep and operational. Patch raised his head from the outer pile edge. His eyes found mine with the speed they had been developing over the past week. I looked north and back at him. He moved before I turned to check the others. His leg was at 70%. Running hard through a full night relocation was going to cost him something. I filed that as a debt I was going to owe him and pay back when the opportunity existed. Silver led the pack out through the back entrance in single file, making no more sound than the forest was already making. I went last and checked the exterior of the entrance once before leaving. No visible trace from outside in the dark. Good. If the facility team arrived before dawn, they would find a cold den, old scent, and no indication of where the pack had gone or how long ago they had left. I ran the route I had been scouting in pieces over the past week, crossing 3 separate stream beds to break the scent trail consistently, then curving east before turning south toward the hollow. The hollow was 6 kilometers from the original den and was not on any map. A human following standard wildlife movement patterns would have had any reason to look at or include in an operational plan. Silver ran at the front without direction from me. I had run sections of this route during solo scouting, and the pack had followed my detours often enough that the general bearing had become familiar. Nobody gave speeches. Nobody called meetings. Information transferred through movement and repetition, and the slow accumulation of shared routes walked enough times to become instinct in the group. In my previous life, I had worked in environments where enormous effort was spent communicating things that 3 months of shared experience would have transferred automatically and without any documents. We covered 6 kilometers in just over an hour. Patch kept pace the entire time without falling back. The leg held, labored on harder terrain, but held. I checked it every few minutes during the run. The hollow opened up through the trees in the gray pre-dawn light. Silver slowed and circled it once, tested the 2 exit routes, then went inside. The pack followed in the same order they had left the den. I stood at the hollow entrance before going in. The forest behind us was quiet. No facility smell on this wind. No footsteps on the soil at any range my hearing could currently resolve from this position. We had moved before they arrived. Their assumption had already failed, and they didn't know it yet. That window, between an assumption failing and the person realizing it, was exactly the kind of window I needed to learn how to use. I went inside and found a position near the entrance where I could monitor the external air for any change in smell or sound from the direction of the original den. For 2 hours, nothing came. The pack settled. Flicker curled into the pile immediately with the efficiency of something that sleeps anywhere. Conditions are not actively hostile to doing so. Tank arranged himself with more ceremony and less grace than was probably necessary, then found a position he was satisfied with and went still. Scout placed herself near the secondary exit, as she always did. Patch settled beside me near the entrance without being directed to do so. He came and put himself in the position most useful given the situation, and then stayed there without making it a discussion. At dawn, the facility smell arrived from the direction of the original den. Stationary now, no longer moving. They had reached the location and found it empty and were standing in it, processing that fact. The scent stayed in one place for a long time. Then it spread in a circle around the den. Then it split into 2 threads moving in different directions, slow and methodical. A deliberate search pattern. They knew we had moved intentionally. No panic scent in the den, a clean departure, trail broken across 3 stream beds, not a pack startled by a predator. That was planning. That was the behavior of something that had known they were coming and prepared the response in advance. Whoever was directing the facility operation was smart enough to understand exactly what that meant, about what they were dealing with. I sat at the hollow entrance and thought about that. The situation had just shifted in 2 directions at once, which was becoming a pattern I needed to start accounting for. Good news. We were safe for now. The approach had failed. The pack had executed a silent night relocation without any of the three things that would have given our position away. Worse news, the facility now knew it was dealing with something that anticipated their movements. Dr. Oren, based on everything I had observed, would find that information interesting rather than discouraging. She was reading the same Eastern air I was reading, with her nose and considerably more years of experience doing it. She looked at me, and then at the hollow, and then at me again. The question in that sequence was clear. Is this temporary, or is this where we are now? 6 kilometers from the original den was not insurmountable, but the hunting grounds we had been using were built around routes centered on the original location. Relocating permanently meant rebuilding the entire prey tracking system from scratch, and the original den was now under active observation by a team that had just upgraded its threat assessment. Going back was not a reasonable option until something about the underlying situation changed in a meaningful way that I had not yet figured out how to produce. I looked at Silver and tried to communicate. Temporary holding position, working on changing the conditions that make returning viable. She looked back with an expression that wanted a confirmed timeline. I did not have one yet. I did not have the timeline. I looked east at the trees and thought about the underground facility and the woman with the notebook and shadows that moved when I paid the right kind of attention to them. Then I thought about Dr. Oren's whiteboard, the one I had seen for 4 seconds through a hallway window on a Tuesday afternoon about 6 weeks before they put a needle in my arm. Threshold events were the central diagram. Shadow class labeled in the upper section. And next to the first, connected by an arrow pointing right, was a second diagram I hadn't had enough time or angle to read. A circle with lines radiating outward, handwriting underneath it, too small to read from the window at that distance and angle. I had been trying not to think too hard about what that second diagram represented. Whatever it was, Dr. Oren had connected it to shadow class threshold events with an arrow pointing toward the next step. The thing after the threshold event. The thing he had built an underground facility in an ancient forest specifically to be present for. I was growing toward that arrow. The man who had drawn it was 2 kilometers east, waiting for me to arrive, at whatever it pointed at. The route I chose happened to pass directly under the western ridge, where I had spotted the woman with the notebook 2 days before. Her scent was still on the tree she had stood against, faint, 2 days old, readable. And underneath it, a second scent, older, a week, maybe more. She had been standing at this exact location before I ever spotted her. She had been coming here regularly, consistently enough that her scent had built up on the bark the way it only builds up when the same individual returns to the same precise spot, across multiple visits over time. That changed the category she belonged to. This was not a researcher on a single field visit or a hiker who had wandered into the wrong section of a large forest by accident or casual curiosity. Someone with a sustained routine at a specific observation point in a specific section of the western boundary. Someone who had been watching this territory for longer than I had been living inside it. I climbed the ridge and waited at the top. After 40 minutes, I caught her scent on the western wind. Fresh, moving toward the ridge with the quiet, deliberate pace I had observed from above before. She was coming back. She arrived 8 minutes later with the same notebook and binoculars. She moved to the flat rock and began scanning, the focused attention of someone looking for something specific rather than taking in a general view of the landscape. She scanned systematically. The tree line near the original den, the creek crossing, the game trail between the northern boundary and the hollow. She held the binoculars on each location for several seconds. She was looking for the pack. Then she lowered the binoculars, opened the notebook, and wrote something. 30 seconds, several lines. More than a brief observation would require. She was interpreting, not just recording. I watched her write and tried to reconstruct from the angle and speed of the pen what was going on the page. Paragraphs, sentences, not data points. She closed the notebook and looked up without the binoculars this time. The kind of looking that isn't searching for anything specific, but is paying attention to everything at once, simultaneously. Then she looked at the tree line directly where I was positioned. Not at me. Nothing could have revealed my location from where she stood, but at that section of forest, as if something in the air had drawn her attention precisely there. She held that look for about 10 seconds. Then she wrote one more short line in the notebook, closed it, and left through the western trees in the same quiet, careful way she always left. I sat in the tree line for a long time after she was gone. Whatever she was writing required interpretation rather than data recording. She had a consistent routine at this location. She was looking for this pack specifically. She had sensed something in the air that caused her to write one more line after she thought she was done. That was 3 more data points than I had assigned to the category when she was just an unknown on a flat rock with binoculars. She was not facility personnel. She was not a casual observer. She was someone with a sustained, specific research interest in this territory, which landed her somewhere considerably more complicated than the category I had been keeping her in. Not irrelevant. Something else. Something I didn't have a clean word for yet and needed to figure out before it mattered. Whether that interest was a problem or an opportunity was a question I did not yet have enough information to answer cleanly. I filed it under Priority Watch. Do not approach until the category becomes clearer from additional observation. I ran back to the hollow and found Patch at the entrance where I had left him. He read my approach, and then the direction I had come from, the western boundary rather than any normal scouting route. He registered the discrepancy immediately and looked at me. I could see him deciding in real time whether to make it an issue. He decided against it, which I appreciated. He looked at me with the expression he had developed for situations where I had clearly done something he hadn't been informed about and was deciding whether to make that an issue. He decided not to make it an issue, turned, and went back inside. I followed him and settled near the entrance, 3 separate problems moving toward the same location from 3 different directions at the same time. 2 of them active and closing in, 1 of them internal and not yet understood. The prioritization depended on which problem became critical first, and I didn't have enough information to be certain about that order. On day 20, the Alpha returned from a territory run and stood at the hollow entrance for a long time before going inside. He was reading something on the wind I had not yet caught from inside. I went to stand beside him and worked my nose at the same air. It took several minutes to find what he had already found, because it was faint and layered under several other inputs that were easier to read. The original den. Someone had been inside it. Not the facility team making another exterior pass. Someone had gone inside and spent time in there. The scent was specific enough to identify the individual. The woman with the notebook had entered the original den and spent enough time inside to leave a clear scent signature on the interior walls and floor, long enough to sit down and write something. The Alpha looked at me after I caught it. His expression was different from any I had seen from him before. Not the iron assessment of the early days, not the low approval of the trap disposal. Something between those 2 registers that didn't have a clean name. Whatever it translated to, I was fairly sure it meant, "This is now your problem to solve, and I am waiting with some specific interest to see how you approach it." Fair enough. I had created the conditions. I went to the original den that afternoon, approaching from the south, where the facility team had not been operating. The den smelled of the pack, old and layered, and over all of it, fresh and clear, her scent. She had sat in the center of the den. I tracked the position from the scent concentration on the floor. She had sat there and written. The faint chemical smell of ink was present. Notebook open the whole time she was inside. She had not disturbed anything, had not taken samples, had not placed monitoring equipment. I searched every surface carefully. She had simply sat in the center and written for somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes. That specific kind of visit? That was a specific kind of visit. Not collection, not installation. The kind of visit you make to a location when you are trying to understand it from the inside, rather than from any outside vantage point. I sat in the center where her scent was strongest and thought about what this space looked like to someone entering it from outside for the first time, and what that person would write while sitting in here. Then I thought about the fact that she had found this location, entered it, and left without triggering any of the 11 facility traps I had cataloged along the eastern and northern perimeters. She knew where the traps were, or she had been moving through the territory by a route that consistently avoided all 11 positions. Either way required a level of knowledge about this territory, inconsistent with casual observation from a flat rock. Either way, she was considerably more interesting than anything I had previously assigned to the category she was in. I left the den and ran back toward the hollow, stopping at the northern clearing on the way. The shadows came in at the edges, the way they always did now. Closer than physics warranted, present in that quality of awareness I still didn't have language for. I held focus on one and moved it 3 meters before releasing. 3 meters in one session, more than double the best result for my first intentional test. The ability was growing, faster than I had expected, good measured against one axis. Required careful thinking measured against another. Dr. Oren had built an underground facility specifically to be present when this growth happened. Whatever the second diagram represented, it was connected to shadow class growth by an arrow pointing right. I was growing toward that arrow without understanding what was at the end of it. That was the kind of uncertainty I would have preferred to resolve before the person who drew the diagram showed up to observe what happened when I arrived. Day 22. I was running the northern boundary with Scout and Patch when Scout stopped and went into the specific stillness that meant something new was in the air. Not immediately dangerous, significant enough to read carefully before continuing. I stopped beside her and let my nose work. Longer than usual, because whatever it was had traveled a significant distance and scattered through several wind shifts before arriving at this location. Wolves, a lot of them, moving somewhere north of the boundary. Wolves, a lot of them, somewhere north of our current position, beyond the boundary line, moving in a coordinated pattern I recognized from the large pack hunts I had been part of over the past 3 weeks. But not hunting. The movement pattern was wrong for it. They were moving in a spread formation across a wide front. The pattern a pack uses when sweeping a territory for something specific rather than pursuing prey in a direction. A second pack was running a sweep pattern north of our boundary. Large, at least 7 individual scent signatures in the thread before it scattered past the point where I could distinguish them reliably. Scout looked at me. Her expression carried the specific weight that 7 unknown wolves moving in a coordinated sweep toward your boundary warranted when the food calculation was already tight. I looked north and thought about the timing. 3 weeks ago, before the hollow, the expanded perimeter, the woman with the notebook, none of those pressures existed in this territory simultaneously. Now all 3 were here at once. The facility closing from the east, unknown intent from the west. A large outside pack running a sweep pattern along the northern edge. 3 problems, 1 location. Not the distribution I would have chosen to be managing simultaneously. I ran back to the hollow at speed. Patch kept pace beside me without being asked. Scout ran on the other side with the same calculation in her expression that was currently running through mine. The Alpha was at the hollow entrance when we arrived. He had caught the northern scent from further south than I had. Not surprising. His nose had years of calibration I was still in the early stages of building toward. He looked at me when I arrived, then at Scout, then at the north, then back at me. The look lasted 4 seconds and contained more information than most meetings I had attended in my previous life. I met his eyes and held them. Whatever came next required a different level of coordination than a silent midnight relocation. 3 simultaneous pressures from 3 directions with 1 den and finite territory. A genuinely different problem category. The Alpha made the low rumbling sound. Not the approval version, not the directional version. A third version I had not heard before. Somewhere between those 2 registers, carrying a question rather than a statement. Directed at me. He was asking something. In wolf language, without words, looking at me with iron eyes in the hollow entrance 6 days after I had moved the pack there in the middle of the night, without explaining exactly why. He was asking me something and waiting for whatever I was going to do with the question. I looked north where the outside pack was sweeping, then east where the facility had upgraded its threat assessment, then west where the woman with the notebook had been inside our original den, writing careful paragraph-length sentences about a pack she had been watching for longer than I had been living in this territory. Then I looked at the Alpha and did something I had not done once in 22 days of living in this body. I took 3 deliberate steps toward the northern boundary and stopped and looked back at him. The Alpha's ears moved forward slightly. From this wolf, that was the equivalent of putting down everything you were holding to give something your complete and undivided attention without a single word. Silver appeared from inside the hollow and stood beside the Alpha, the 3 of us at the hollow entrance. Facility smell to the east. Outside, pack smell from the north. The faint ink smell of a notebook from the west. The Alpha looked at me for a long moment. Then, the low rumbling sound. Shorter, cleaner, more decisive. Then he turned and went back inside the hollow. I stood at the entrance for a moment, trying to interpret what had just happened. Scout appeared beside me, looking north, then at me, with the expression I had learned to read as noted and not yet agreed. She had a point. What I was thinking was not an obviously good idea. It was the kind of idea that makes sense only when measured against options that are all bad. That is a different thing from the idea itself being good. The outside pack was the only variable that had not yet been assigned a role in whatever Dr. Oren had planned before I arrived in this world. The facility was an antagonist with a plan. The woman with the notebook was an unknown with a sustained routine, but the outside pack was something I had not yet approached and therefore did not know what role to assign it in any of this. In the novel I had died inside, the world had been written by someone. Characters had roles. The plot had a direction. The hero was the hero not because he had earned it, but because the world kept choosing him. This was a different world, but the pattern Dr. Pierce had described, and the route that corrected itself, the hero protection protocol, had been real enough that Amelia went pale when she heard it. This world had a shape, too. Things happened in it that were not random. This world had a shape, too. Things happened that were not random. The facility had followed me across whatever boundary existed between the world I died in and the one I woke up inside. That was not random. The woman with the notebook had been watching this territory before I arrived. The outside pack was sweeping toward our location at exactly the moment when 3 other pressures were converging. Coincidence, or the world arranging things toward a specific outcome? If the outcome was one Dr. Oren had designed, running from it indefinitely was probably not a workable long-term strategy. He had patience. He had infrastructure. He had followed a dead subject across a dimensional boundary and set up a facility to wait. That was not the profile of someone who gives up because the specimen moved 6 kilometers and crossed 3 stream beds in the middle of the night and disappeared into a hollow he hadn't mapped yet. I needed something he had not planned for, something not in the second diagram on his whiteboard, something that changed the shape of the situation before he finished building the conditions he needed to produce the outcome he wanted. A large outside pack running a sweep pattern on the northern boundary was something Dr. Oren would have factored into his timeline as an obstacle to managing this territory. He would have a way to handle an obstacle, but not a resource. But he would have planned around it as an obstacle, not as a resource, not as something that could be approached and potentially incorporated into a calculation entirely different from the one he was running. I started walking north. Scout stood at the hollow edge and watched me. Patch appeared in the entrance beside her and looked at the direction I was walking, then at Scout with a question in his posture. Scout looked at him, then back at me. Then she made a decision I heard in the sound of her paws on frozen ground as she fell into pace 3 body lengths behind me and held that position. Patch followed half a second after that. The 3 of us moved north through the gray winter forest. Toward the boundary line, and beyond it, 7 or more wolves running a sweep pattern heading directly. Toward everything I was trying to keep intact. The boundary was 2 kilometers from the hollow. We reached it in about 25 minutes, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough to have something left. Before the conversation I was about to attempt with 7 wolves I had never encountered. I stopped at the boundary line and read the air north of it. The outside pack had slowed. The sweep pattern had compressed into a holding position. They had scented our boundary and were assessing it before committing to any response. They knew we were here. They had probably known for several days from the scent signatures on the boundary markers. They had been running toward our boundary for a reason. The question was what that reason was. I crossed the boundary line. Scout and Patch crossed behind me without hesitation, which I registered as the specific kind of trust that costs something to give and should not be taken lightly or wasted. About 300 meters north of the boundary, I stopped and sat in the most visible clearing I could find. Good sight lines from every direction. Nothing about my position readable as preparation for anything other than waiting. I sat there, Scout beside me, Patch to my left with his leg extended. 3 of us in the snow, north of our own boundary line. For 8 minutes, nothing happened. The wind moved through the upper branches in a sound that had no human equivalent. Somewhere north, something very large moved through underbrush with the controlled, deliberate pace of something big being careful. Then 1 wolf appeared at the northern tree line. Large male, dark gray, the specific posture of a senior pack member sent forward to assess a situation before the group commits to any particular response. He looked at us. 3 wolves, 1 black, 1 gray-brown with a white chest patch and an injured leg extended in the snow. 1 smaller gray female sitting with the calm of something that had already made its peace with being in this specific position. He read us for a long time. Then he looked back into the trees and made a sound I had not heard before but understood as, "Come see this. It is not what we expected to find waiting for us out here." 4 more wolves appeared at the tree line, then 2 more. 7 total, matching my scent count from the boundary. They stood in a loose group and looked at the 3 of us, sitting in the snow in the open. The lead wolf looked at me specifically, not at Scout, not at Patch. Something in my posture, my scent, or simply being black in a territory where black wolves apparently didn't occur was directing his attention toward me. I met his eyes and held them for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to establish I was not submitting, short enough to not read as a challenge, then looked slightly to the side, the same timing I had used with the alpha on day 7. The lead wolf tilted his head slightly. 1 ear moved in a direction that, on a human face, would have been the expression you make when something fails to match the category you had prepared to use for it. We sat like that for a long moment. 7 wolves at the tree line, 3 in the clearing, in the snow and the gray winter light. The facility smell drifted up from the south. The outside pack's scent was thick in the cold air around us. Then I did something my wolf instincts were filing very loud objections about, even as I did it. I turned my back on 7 unknown wolves and looked south toward where the facility ran its continuous electrical hum into the soil of this ancient forest. Scout went completely still beside me. Patch's breathing changed in the way it changed when he was recalculating whether the current situation was still within an acceptable risk range. The range he had agreed to when he followed me north of the boundary. The lead wolf looked south. I watched the moment it registered in his posture, the specific tightening that comes when a nose finds something that has no business existing in a forest this old and this far from anything running on electrical power. He looked at me. I looked south. He looked south again and made a sound to the wolves behind him. All 7 shifted from assessment mode into something closer to the register I had learned to associate with serious and fully paying attention. I turned back and met the lead wolf's eyes for longer this time. 4 seconds. 5. Long enough to move past the submitting or challenging binary into something new. He took 1 step forward into the clearing. Stopped. Looked at me. Looked south. Looked back at me with the expression of someone working through a decision and arriving somewhere they hadn't expected to go. Then he sat down in the snow about 10 meters from where I was sitting. Just sat. In the open. In the specific posture of something that has not yet made a decision, but has decided to stay in the space where it will eventually be made. I looked at him. I looked south where Dr. Oren's facility hummed beneath the soil of a forest older than the concept of research facilities. Then back at the lead wolf, 7 wolves running a sweep pattern. An underground facility with a funded, patient, long-term operation. A researcher who had followed a dead subject across a dimensional boundary, waiting for a threshold event he had designed the environment to produce. And a shadow ability that had moved 3 meters in the last session, growing faster than expected toward an endpoint I didn't understand. Drawn on a whiteboard I'd seen for 4 seconds through a hallway window on a Tuesday afternoon. The lead wolf was still sitting in the snow looking at me. The 7 wolves behind him were still at the tree line, still shifted into the serious and paying attention register, still reading the southern air. I had 4 seconds of a whiteboard diagram. A shadow ability I barely understood, a pack that had followed me north of their own boundary, and a lead wolf sitting in a clearing 10 meters away, waiting to see what I did next with all of that. Whatever Dr. Oren had planned for the threshold event, and whatever the arrow was pointing at, I was fairly certain it had not included this specific clearing, these specific wolves, and whatever was about to happen between us here in the snow. The lead wolf looked at me and waited. The forest was completely quiet. Whatever came next was going to start here, in this clearing, with these 7 wolves and the one choice Dr. Oren had not accounted for in any of his plans. The lead wolf was still sitting in the snow 10 meters from me. The forest was completely quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of everything waiting to see what came next. I had one move, not a wolf move, not an instinct I had been born with or developed in 22 days in this body. A human move, the kind that makes sense only when you have spent enough time in situations where the standard options are all bad, and you need to create a 5th option that nobody planned for. I looked at the lead wolf. I looked south toward where the facility ran its electrical hum into the soil of a forest that had been old before any facility existed anywhere in any world. Then I stood up and walked toward him, not fast, not slow, the pace of something that has made a decision and is implementing it without second-guessing every step of the process. Scout made a very quiet sound behind me. Not alarm, something more like the sound you make when someone you've been watching makes a choice you disagree with, but understand you can't stop. I covered the 10 meters and sat down again about 2 meters from the lead wolf. That close, in the open, on his side of the informal line that had existed between us for the past several minutes. He did not move. His ears stayed forward. He read every piece of information my body was broadcasting into the air between us, and arrived at some conclusion I could not read from the outside. Then he leaned forward and sniffed the air directly in front of me, long and deliberate. The same Red Silver had given me on my first night in this world, deciding whether to pick me up by the scruff. He pulled back and looked at me with an expression I did not have a translation for. Something between assessment and recognition. The look of something identifying a category it was not expecting to find. I looked south again, held it for 5 seconds. Then I looked back at the lead wolf and held his gaze for the same 5 seconds. Not the 2-second version, the duration of 2 things looking at each other as equals. He looked south. He read the air from that direction one more time, and then he made a sound I had not heard any wolf make in 22 days of living inside this territory. Low, sustained, with a resonance I felt more in my chest than my ears. Not a howl, not a warning, not any of the communication sounds I had cataloged over the past 3 weeks of careful observation. Something older than those, something that felt like it belonged to the part of wolf language that existed before the categories I had been learning were even developed. It did not feel like no. Scout appeared beside me 2 seconds after the sound ended. She had crossed from where she had been sitting and taken a position at my left without any instruction from me or any signal from the other group. Patch came to my right 3 seconds after that. Slower because of the leg, but without any hesitation in the intention behind the movement. The lead wolf responded without turning. A short, clipped answer that produced an immediate visible relaxation in the posture of every wolf still standing there. I watched that exchange and thought about what it would have cost in my previous life to have the kind of authority that could make 6 people visibly relax with 3 syllables. Quite a lot, probably. The lead wolf stood up. Not threatening. The slow, deliberate movement of something that has made a decision and is moving in the direction of it. He looked at the tree line and made 2 sounds in sequence. The 6 wolves moved out immediately, spreading into a loose formation between our location and the northern approach. Not surrounding us. The geometry was completely wrong for surrounding. They were positioning between our location and the direction they had come from. The north, not the south, where the facility was. They were now facing the same direction we were facing. I sat very still and processed that. 7 wolves from an outside pack had just oriented themselves to stand between my group and their own home territory, facing the same problem, standing on the same side of it. I looked at the lead wolf. He looked at me. The quality of the forest's quiet had changed. Earlier it had been waiting. Now it was something closer to a decision that has been made and hasn't started producing consequences yet. I stood up. I looked south toward the hollow, the territory, the underground facility 2 kilometers away, and getting closer in its understanding of this pack every single day. Then I started walking south. I looked back once. The lead wolf was watching me with those eyes. Behind him, the 6 wolves in the northern formation held their position. Scout fell into pace beside me immediately. Patch came up on my right. We walked south without looking back again, because some things are better left as invitations than requests. We crossed back over the boundary line into our own territory, and I held the pace all the way back to the hollow without slowing. The Alpha was at the entrance, as he always was. He looked at the direction we had come from, then at me, then at Scout and Patch. He read everything the 3 of us were carrying back from the northern boundary and arrived at a conclusion I could feel in the air around him. He made the low rumbling sound, the 3rd version, the one that carried a question. I looked north, and then at him, and then north again. He held that for a moment, then he went back inside. More validation than I had expected from a wolf who communicated almost entirely through absence and sound. I filed it as a reasonable outcome and went inside and tried to process what had just happened. The outside pack had not attacked. They had not driven us back over the boundary. They had repositioned toward the same problem we were oriented toward. That was not what I had planned when I walked those 10 meters. It was not an alliance. I knew enough about wolf social structure to know that calling it one would embarrass me. It was a shared orientation toward a shared problem. The facility smell was in this territory, and now I suspected it was also in the territory north of the boundary line, which was why they had been running that sweep pattern. They had been trying to locate the source of the facility's smell before it located them, the same thing I had been trying to do from the inside for 3 weeks. Same problem. Same direction of concern. I lay at the back of the hollow with that thought for about an hour. Tank was asleep to my left. Flicker was asleep on top of him, which Tank had decided not to make an issue of. Patch came and lay down beside me in the specific way he had developed over the past week, not touching. Just close enough that I could hear his breathing and he could hear mine. That was enough. I thought about Dr. Oren's whiteboard, about the second diagram with the circle and the radiating lines, about the arrow pointing from the threshold event to whatever came next in his planned sequence. I thought about shadows moving 3 meters in a single session, about the ability growing faster than expected, about what Dr. Oren had built an underground facility to be present for when it arrived, and I thought about the woman with the notebook, who had been inside our original den, who moved through 11 traps without triggering any of them, who wrote in paragraphs rather than data points. 3 things I had been thinking about separately. Underground facility, shadow ability growing towards something planned, independent researcher who knew the territory better than she should. For the first time, I put all 3 of them in the same thought and held them there and looked at what that produced. It produced a question I should have asked weeks ago. What if the woman with the notebook wasn't independent? What if she was connected to the facility, but not in the way the facility's field teams were connected to it? What if she was the opposition? I sat with that for a long time in the dark, with Patch breathing beside me and Tank snoring at a volume the hollow's acoustics were doing nothing to reduce. If the woman with the notebook was researching the facility rather than the pack, if her sustained observation of this territory was about understanding the operation built underneath it, then everything I had assigned to her category needed to change. Her notebook was not a record of wolf behavior. It was a field record of an operation she was investigating. The paragraphs were analysis. The trap avoidance was operational knowledge. The visit to the den was not a study of wolf living conditions. It was a study of what the facility team had been doing in and around it. And if that was true, she was potentially the most useful unknown variable I had encountered since waking up in this forest with 4 paws and no information. Day 23. I went to the western ridge in the early morning, before the pack's schedule produced any movement visible in the facility team's behavioral mapping of the territory. I moved through the approach she always used. The same route, the same angles, the same careful foot placement on the frozen ground I had memorized from watching her from above. I reached the flat rock on the ridge and sat on it, not in the forest edge where I had been observing her, on the rock itself, in full view of anything coming from the west, in her spot. Then I waited. The morning was cold and gray and completely indifferent to the fact that I was sitting on a flat rock doing something my wolf instincts were filing under the general category of why. She arrived about 40 minutes after I took the position. She came through the western trees at her usual pace and stopped about 30 meters back when she saw me on the rock that was supposed to be empty. She did not run. She did not reach for anything. She stood very still and read the situation. The same focused attention she brought to observing the territory through binoculars. Then she took 1 step forward. She stopped. Read me again. 2 more steps. Stopped again. The approach of someone who knows that things which look like they're waiting to be approached sometimes are. Stopped again. The careful approach of someone who knows that things which look like they're waiting to be approached sometimes are. Sometimes are. She covered 30 meters in about 4 minutes of careful movement. When she stopped, she was about 5 meters from the rock where I was sitting, that close in the cold morning air. Her eyes were very focused. She was not afraid. Or if she was, the part of her that operated in the field had learned to work alongside fear rather than stop for it. She opened the notebook without looking down at the page, still watching me. She wrote something. Then she held the notebook up toward me with the page facing outward, handwriting large and clear. "I can help. Do you understand me?" I looked at the words. I looked at her. She held the notebook steady and waited with the patience of someone who had learned what waiting actually cost. I looked at the words one more time. Then I looked directly at her and blinked twice, slowly, deliberately, the specific voluntary movement completely different from the involuntary blink of an animal looking at something bright. She went completely still. Then she wrote something else and held the notebook up again. "If you understand this, look east." I looked east, toward the facility, toward the underground installation, and Dr. Oren sitting at a screen watching biometric readings from a subject he thought he had cornered. I held that look for a long moment. Then I looked back at her. She sat down in the snow about 4 meters from the rock, at ground level, in the posture of someone who has decided they are going to be here for a while and wants to communicate that. She opened the notebook to a new page and started writing with the care of someone composing something they need to get right. She wrote for about 3 minutes. Then she held the notebook up. "Project Hollow is not what Oren says it is. The shadow ability is not a weapon. It is a key. The facility exists to contain what comes after the threshold event, not to study it. I have been here for 2 months. I know what he is planning. I read it twice, then once more. The cold morning air moved through the trees and the forest, made its small sounds, and somewhere east, the underground facility ran its continuous note into the soil like a clock. A key, not a weapon. The shadow ability was not the endpoint in Dr. Oren's diagram. It was the means of reaching the endpoint. Something opened when a shadow class awakened crossed the threshold. Something that Dr. Oren had built a containment facility to capture rather than study. I thought about the circle in the second diagram, the radiating lines, the handwriting too small to read from a hallway window. I thought about every conversation I had heard through vents and doorways in the weeks before they put the needle in my arm. Project Hollow. Not a research program, a capture program. And I was not the specimen they were waiting to study. I was the instrument they were waiting to use. There was a difference. And understanding it had just rearranged everything I thought I knew about my situation. She was writing again. She held up the notebook. "The facility goes active tomorrow night. That is when the threshold event is scheduled. He has been forcing the conditions. Everything in this territory for 3 weeks has been designed to push your ability to threshold faster than it would develop naturally." I sat with that for a moment that felt considerably longer than it actually was. 3 weeks of what I had been treating as separate problems had been a single coordinated system designed to accelerate one specific outcome. The facility smell getting stronger every day. The perimeter traps, the expanded northern operation, the outside pack's sweep pattern. All of it coordinated, designed to add the exact kind of pressure needed. Stress that pushed a developing ability toward threshold faster. I had been solving each problem individually while the system continued to do exactly what it was designed to do. That was the part that sat in my chest in the specific way that things sit in your chest when you realize how comprehensively you have been played. She held up the notebook again. "I am Dr. Voss. I was on the original Project Hollow team. I know how to shut it down, but I need you to trust me before tomorrow night or the window closes. Dr. Voss." The name didn't connect to anything I had heard in the facility, but there were entire floors I had never seen and entire conversations I had never been close enough to overhear. A researcher who had been on the original team, who had left or been removed, who had come here independently 2 months before I arrived and had been observing this territory since before I ever woke up, in this body, who had been inside our original den and sat in the center of it for 20 to 40 minutes, not studying the wolves, but studying what the facility team had been doing in and around the location where the pack slept. She had known there was something unusual in this territory before I ever arrived in it. And she had come back to the same ridge on the same schedule, not because she was tracking wolves, but because she was tracking an awakened in a wolf body, waiting for the moment when communication was going to become possible. I looked at her for a long time. She held my gaze with the steadiness of someone who had been waiting for this moment and had decided to be completely present for it. I stood up from the rock. I looked east toward the facility one more time. Then I looked at her for 5 full seconds. Then I turned and walked east into the forest. I stopped after 15 meters and looked back at her. She was on her feet, notebook closed, with an expression that was working very hard to stay composed and not entirely succeeding. I waited. She started walking toward me. I moved east again, stopped, waited. She followed. I moved east again. It was not subtle. It was not elegant. It was the communication of something without access to spoken language, trying to say, "Follow me now." She understood it. She kept following. We moved east through the gray winter forest together, one wolf, one researcher, 30 meters of careful distance between them, toward a hollow where a pack was sleeping. The Alpha was at the hollow entrance when we arrived. He looked at me, then at Dr. Voss. She had stopped about 40 meters back and was holding completely still with the body language of someone who understands that the next 30 seconds matter. The Alpha looked at me for a long moment. His iron eyes moved from my face to the woman at the tree line and back. I met his gaze and held it. He stepped aside from the entrance. Not away, to the side. The specific movement that clears a path without abandoning the position. The message: I am allowing this. I'm not endorsing it. I'm watching everything. I walked to the entrance and looked back at Dr. Voss. She moved forward slowly, reading every piece of the situation she was walking into with the careful attention she brought to everything. Silver appeared from inside the hollow and looked at Dr. Voss with an expression I recognized, the same long, deliberate red she had given me on my first night in this world, deciding whether to pick me up by the scruff. Dr. Voss stopped about 6 meters from Silver and very slowly sat down in the snow. Head below Silver's eye level, no sudden movements. The body language of someone who had done enough field work to know which mistakes were forgivable and which ones were not. Silver read her for a long moment, then looked at me, then turned and went back inside the hollow. The message in that sequence was clear enough that Dr. Voss understood it without any translation from me. Not a threat, not an endorsement. A permission and a warning delivered simultaneously in the body language of something that had been navigating complicated situations for a very long time. Dr. Voss let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 90 seconds. Then she opened her notebook and started writing. She wrote for several minutes. When she held the notebook up, the page was dense with information she had clearly been preparing to share since long before today. Project Hollow schematic. Facility goes active at 2 a.m. tomorrow. Orin uses environmental stressors to force your ability to threshold. When it hits, a resonance array buried under the eastern boundary captures the energy signature. She turned the page. More writing. She held it up. The array opens a secondary threshold. Not in you, in the territory itself. That is what the circle in the second diagram is. A permanent gate? Orin wants to control what comes through it? I read every line twice. Then I looked east at the trees. I thought about a circle with radiating lines drawn on a whiteboard in a room I had seen for 4 seconds, through a hallway window on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a diagram of an ability. A diagram of a gate. The radiating lines were not the ability spreading outward. They were the things that would come through the gate, catalogued, numbered, planned for. She wrote again and held up the notebook. To shut down the array, someone with shadow class ability has to reach the resonance node before the facility activates. The node is 20 meters below the surface at the eastern boundary. You have until 2 a.m. I looked at the time information and then looked east and ran the distances in my head. Eastern boundary, 2 kilometers away. Resonance node, 20 meters underground. Facility activates at 2 in the morning. One night, one specific underground target. One ability that had moved 3 meters in the last session and was being pushed toward a threshold that someone had planned around for considerably longer than I had been alive in this body. I stood up and looked at the Alpha. He was still at the hollow entrance, still watching, still communicating an enormous amount of information through the specific quality of his silence. I looked at him for a long moment, then east, then at him again. He held my gaze with those iron eyes that had assessed me on day 7 and had been reassessing continuously ever since. He made the low, rumbling sound. The third version, the one that asked a question. I looked east one more time. He looked east. Then at the hollow entrance. Then at me. He was asking whether what I was about to do was going to protect what was in that hollow or cost it. That was the question, in wolf language, from an Alpha who had extended 3 weeks of trust to something that moved wrong and thought differently. I looked at the hollow where Tank was probably asleep on something he wasn't supposed to be on, where Scout was at the secondary exit, where Patch was near the entrance, healing. I looked at Silver just inside the entrance with those pale eyes that had carried me through the forest on my first night, and had been reading me. Every morning since. I looked at the Alpha and met his eyes and held them for 10 seconds. Longer than I had ever held eye contact with him. Long enough to move past every category of wolf eye contact I had cataloged and into something I didn't have a word for. Then I walked east, toward the facility, toward the eastern boundary, toward 20 meters of frozen soil and a resonance array that was going to activate in less than 12 hours. Dr. Voss fell into pace beside me at a careful distance. Patch appeared from the hollow entrance before I had covered 30 meters. I heard his paws on the frozen ground without looking back. Scout came next. Then, after a moment that held just long enough to communicate that it was a choice and not a reflex, Silver fell in behind me at the pace she set when something mattered. The Alpha came last. I heard him join somewhere around the 200-meter mark and did not turn around. But I heard the specific quality of his footfall, deliberate, unhurried, decided, and that was enough. 8 of us moving east through the gray winter forest, 1 researcher with a notebook and 7 wolves, toward a boundary line and 20 meters of frozen earth and whatever came after both. Dr. Voss was keeping pace on my left with the notebook out, writing as she walked. A skill I noted and added to the growing list of things she was apparently capable of doing simultaneously. She held the notebook toward me as we walked. 1 more line, large and clear. The shadow ability doesn't need to cross the threshold. It needs to reach through it. There is a difference. Oren doesn't know you know that. I read it twice. Reach through the threshold rather than cross it. Dr. Oren had designed his system around the assumption that a shadow class awakened would cross the threshold without understanding what they were crossing. He had not planned for a shadow class awakened who had seen his whiteboard for 4 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon, and had been thinking about the second diagram ever since without fully understanding it until now. The eastern boundary appeared through the trees ahead, the Alpha's scent markers on the tree trunks. Beyond it, the facility smell was thick enough to be the dominant note in everything the air was carrying. I stopped at the boundary line. The pack stopped behind me. Dr. Voss stopped at my left. The forest held the specific quiet it had held in the clearing this morning when the lead wolf sat in the snow and everything waited. I looked east. Somewhere 2 kilometers in that direction, 20 meters underground, was a resonance array going to activate in less than 12 hours and produce a gate that Dr. Oren had been planning around since before I existed in this world. I thought about the northern clearing and the shadows that had moved when I paid the right kind of attention to them. 3 meters in the last session. Growing faster than expected toward an endpoint I now understood. I sat down at the boundary line and closed my eyes. The pack settled around me. Scout to my left, Patch to my right, Silver behind me, Tank and Flicker flanking at a distance, the Alpha at the boundary tree between me and the facility. Dr. Voss sat down about 3 meters to my left and did not write anything. She just sat, present and quiet in the specific way of someone who understands that what needs to happen now is not something they can help with by doing anything at all. I focused inward, not pushing, not straining, not performing for any audience internal or external, the way I had learned to do it in the northern clearing, the internal resonance that the facility had tried to force and had only made harder to find. The shadow presence came in immediately, faster than it had ever come before because I had been practicing and because the ability was close to threshold. And because something in the air at this boundary line was charged with the electrical quality I had been smelling for 3 weeks from the wrong side. The shadows moved in without being asked, closer. I focused east, downward, 20 meters, the direction Dr. Voss had given me, held in my mind with the same quality of attention I had used in the northern clearing, but pointed underground at the specific depth where the resonance array was waiting. The shadows went with the attention, not dramatically, not with any visible light or sound. They followed the focus the way they had been following it since the first night I sat in the northern clearing. Stopped demanding that they perform. I felt the resonance array before I reached it. Less than 12 hours from activation had a specific quality. The pressure of a system that has been building toward a state for a long time and is close enough to already begin producing its effects. I reached it. The shadow attention touched the array, and I understood immediately what Dr. Voss had meant by a gate, not a metaphor. A real engineered structure designed to use the energy signature of a threshold event to force an opening in something that was not supposed to have openings. And I understood what she had meant about reaching through rather than crossing. The threshold was not a wall. It was a membrane. Start. I pulled the shadow attention back from the activation pathway, not from the array itself, from the connection to the surface installation that would send the activation signal at 2 in the morning. I reached through and found the activation mechanism, felt its structure, understood what it needed in order to work, and more importantly, what it needed in order to stop working before it had the chance to. The forest was completely quiet. The pack settled around me in the positions they had taken. I looked east. The facility smell was still there. The hum was still there. Dr. Voss was 3 meters to my left. The forest was completely quiet. The pack settled around me in the positions they had taken. I looked east. The facility smell was there. The hum was there. Dr. Voss was still 3 meters to my left. Voss was still 3 meters to my left. I held it. 30 seconds. A minute. The path stayed blocked. The array stayed inactive. The connection between the underground node and the surface installation stayed interrupted in the quiet way that the shadow ability interrupted things when applied correctly. Then I opened my eyes. The eastern boundary line was in front of me. The forest was completely quiet. The pack settled around me in the positions they had taken. I looked east. The facility smell was still there. The electrical hum was still there. Dr. Oren was still underground, 2 kilometers east, waiting for a threshold event that was not going to arrive, going to produce the outcome he had been planning for. Because the pathway was blocked, and it was going to stay blocked for as long as the shadow presence remained in it. This pack around me, for as long as it needed to. I looked at Dr. Voss. She held up the notebook one more time. Did it work? I looked east, then at her. Then I blinked twice, slowly, the same way I had done it on the flat rock this morning when she had held up the page that said, "I can help," and I had decided that I could hear that. She closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest and looked at the gray winter sky through the tree canopy above. She let out a breath that sounded like it had been held in various forms for approximately 2 months. The Alpha appeared beside me. I had not heard him move from the boundary tree. He looked east for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He made the low, rumbling sound. The third version, the one with the question. This time it felt different. Less like a question, and more like the sound of a question that has arrived at an answer it was satisfied with and is acknowledging that fact out loud in the only language available to it. I looked at him. He looked east one more time. Then he turned and walked back toward the hollow. Silver followed. Tank and Flicker followed. Scout walked beside Patch on the way back, which I noted with a feeling I did not have a wolf word for and did not need one. I looked east for another long moment. The facility was still there. Dr. Oren was still there. The array was still there, inactive, with a shadow presence blocking its activation pathway, like a hand over a drain. But a gate that had been planned for years was not going to open tonight, and a specimen that had been designed to be a key was not the key anymore. Or at least, not the key anyone had planned for. It was something else now, something that Dr. Oren's whiteboard did not have a diagram for, something he was going to have to account for anyway, starting in the morning when his equipment showed him that the activation had failed and the failure had come from inside the ability he had spent months designing a facility around. Patch stayed beside me for a moment before turning to follow the pack. He pressed his muzzle briefly against the side of my neck. 1 second. Then he turned and walked after the others. I stayed at the boundary line a little longer. Dr. Voss stayed too, about 3 meters away. Not writing, not looking at her notebook. Just present in the cold, gray morning light with the forest making its small sounds around both of us. After a while, I turned and walked back toward the hollow. Dr. Voss walked parallel to me at a careful distance. The facility hummed behind us, underground, blocked. The forest made its sounds. The cold pressed down on everything in it evenly. And somewhere back at the hollow, Tank was probably already asleep on something he wasn't supposed to be sleeping on, which meant the world was continuing to operate in a basically recognizable way. That was enough. For now, in this body, in this forest, with this pack, that was exactly enough. Whatever came next, it was going to find something waiting for it that Dr. Oren had not put in any diagram.